is often our favorite part of the day, to have a panel of industry leaders and influencers that are going to spend the next hour, taking us through, CISO insights, industry leaders discussing current cyber threats and strategic defense practices, securing the future. So the next hour, Shane, I'm going to hand over to you. Take it away.
Thank you. All right. Welcome, everybody. Glad we're all here. As Andrew said, my name is Shane Jones. My mother didn't call me Shannon when I got in trouble, so we'll stick with Shane. But we'll kick it off to the panel for a brief introduction before we kick off.
You guys probably heard enough from me today. Andy Neller, Deputy CISO at Wellmark Blue Cross Blue Shield. And so I'll go ahead and hand it off to the other panelists.
Hey, my name is Benjamin Hall. I'm one of the incident response case managers at FRSecure. So typically when people talk to me, it's usually one of the worst days they're having of their career. So I deal with ransomware cases, email compromises, and coaching. So it's pretty much me in a nutshell. So I deal with pretty gnarly stuff on a regular basis. So that's kind of what I'm bringing to the table here.
Ben and people in his field are my heroes. I'm glad to know somebody's there to help us if we ever need them. Bob Duplessis, Old Second National Bank. I'm the CISO. We're a $6 billion organization with a little over 50 branches in the Chicagoland area.
And I guess as I already stated, my name is Shane Jones. I'm the CISO for Kingland Systems. So we do custom application software, so I get to play in all kinds of online web fun. But we have a list of panel questions here that were submitted and came through, so we're just going to kind of walk through those. And obviously, audience participation is encouraged. I think we have some chocolates and sugar to throw at you if you do have a question. So, all right, we will go ahead and kick off. The first topic is emerging threats. So what are the most significant emerging cybersecurity threats, and how should organizations prepare for them? Anybody want to start us off?
I'll start us off. One of the things that gets a lot of attention from the bank is ransomware as a service. I think you've heard a lot of news articles where someone gets hit with a ransom, and it's not the organization that tells everybody about it. It's the actual hacker, threat agent that puts it in the media and forces their hand to try to get them to pay the ransom. One of the ways we tackle that is making sure our playbook's up to date, make sure we have a plan on if and when we ever think about paying a ransomware. Management makes that decision. So it's nothing that we want to make sure that we have enough time to respond accordingly, but the ransomware as a service agents really make the process speed up quite a bit now.
Yeah, as far as most significant, one of the vectors that is kind of hot topic or relevant lately is partner organizations, right? So we're seeing a lot of organizations have lateral movement, and so organizations can have an attack vector that they may not realize. So you may have, VPN connections to your partners. You may have remote access software from someone you trust, someone that is related to your organization, has a close relationship. And if those things are going unchecked, those are the areas that attackers are focusing on right now. We see this evident in the Kaseya case a few years ago. We see this evident with healthcare recently. And ultimately, these attackers are targeting infrastructure pieces that really do have an impact to the standard American citizen along with the rest of the world. So we're seeing this impacting healthcare, different revenue sources, different areas of industry, critical infrastructure. And, it's one thing that's heavily overlooked right now is that let me ask you this. Are you really questioning these organizations that you're allowing into your company, right? Are you auditing them? Are you doing proper third-party management? Are you holding them accountable when there is something? Are they contractually obligated to talk to you about these things? So it's just an area that clearly right now is, I think, relevant, and you need to start asking yourselves, is this applicable to you?
I think I'll build off that a little bit as we start talking about like third and fourth party risk, as that's one of those things that has been near and dear to my heart. So you really do what you can with your control structures in your own ecosystem. When you start dealing with these vendors, when they may equally have as much important data that what you have internally, it's like, how are they dealing with that? And are you asking the right questions? And then even understanding the ecosystem of what that may mean. So if I go back to like what happened with Change Healthcare, and you started getting into saying, well, what does this even look in the industry? And do you all know what that impact may be? And then even how that may be your third and fourth parties. So I know with us, we weren't necessarily directly materially impacted, but our third and fourth parties had some impact, which then in turn impacted us or their ability to deal with, say, some of our providers. So it's one of those things that making sure you're not only then asking the right questions, but then who's following up with that vendor? And do you have the right contractual relationships with them to do something material about that? And then, executing that with your leadership or communicating those gaps up to your risk management functions. So definitely, as you look at that, you got to keep a watchful eye on the horizon for, those areas.
All right, I'll jump into that one as well. Obviously, I agree with these guys. I'll take a slightly different approach of our own people hurting ourselves, as we've talked about AI throughout the day. If you're familiar with Hanlon's razor that says don't attribute to malice what can be attributed to stupidity, if I paraphrase that correctly, of our own people putting things into AI engines, putting things out there, trying to do their best work, but not understanding what happens and where that data goes. So is it a threat from external? No, but it's an internal threat that I think we need to continue to teach people about and have awareness campaigns about as well. Next on the list is in the same topic of emerging threats. In the evolving landscape, what new attack vectors are gaining prominence and how can they be effectively mitigated?
So when we talk about an incident response plan, the kind of philosophy that we preach is the pick roll. Is everybody familiar with the pick roll model from SANS? So the whole phase of preparation, right? So it's talking about what avenues do we need to start being aware of, what places, what things, and really understanding what your footprint is externally, right? So understanding where an attack could happen and having the proper documentation and realistically those playbooks, the plan. A lot of the times when we get engaged with clients, it's quite common that they don't have a plan, or maybe there's an attack vector that they're not prepared for. They don't know how to handle these things. And so one of those things is really focusing on the basics, right? So having a good foundation to build upon is just something that is heavily underappreciated, I think, right now. And as far as having an effective incident response plan is thoroughly testing, right? So whether that means engaging in internal operations, if you're blessed with having an internal red team and blue team to be able to do purple team type efforts, testing controls, testing alarms, testing these things, and realistically, tabletops are also one of the primary functions of testing those tabletops. You can identify a lot of avenues that really can be called out with testing of those plans. So without that, I think if you have a lot of documentation and things are not vetted, you may have a gap.
So when I think of like evolving landscapes, this one's not so much new, but I think it's gaining a lot of attention. So when I think of what we've been dealing with around like third-party compromises, as we talk at like third and fourth-party risk, I think people need to understand as they get into not so much a new attack vector, but understanding their exposure in some of these systems that they're adopting. So I know we'll talk about cloud security a little bit later on, but especially as you get into your cloud provider, just understanding the shared responsibility model, but as you get into, like, I'll pick on Microsoft, is like understanding that you've got the proper licensing as well, in addition to what you're accountable for. So I think as we look at the kind of evolving threat landscape, part of that gets into just understanding that ecosystem and making sure that you're being positioned for success in how you're going to respond to that. Because I know when we've dealt with some third parties and we're like, hey, you obviously are having an email issue. And like, well, that's covered, right? And I'm like, well, you need to look at your licensing agreement and who set that up? And I'm like, well, isn't that Microsoft's responsibility? And like, well, yeah, you're in Office 365, but that's really on you guys. So, it's bad when we're breaking the bad news to them. So it's understanding, that landscape and what your attack surface looks like and keeping on top of that. And then also so you can make sure you're managing your gaps appropriately.
Just to touch on what Ben conveyed, is when you have your playbooks and you test your playbooks, you need to make sure that the players are involved in it. And this goes to expanding security training. Our risk scenarios are tested to the playbook to make sure they're going to be effective if they're ever needed, and making sure the players know their role, how they help, or how they even are part of the problem in causing it. It brings more attention, and it speeds up the process if something were to actually happen.
Real quick on the playbooks, because I'm a big believer in, not only just testing those out, but for those of us in the Midwest here, if you call it a derecho, that was a great test of your resiliency. And it's like, who's got an internet connection and I can actually get in to actually, service and respond to threats as they're coming into your organization? Because the hackers, they keep going, and it's just like who in our operations center can actually get connected. And so we have a lot of very well documented run books that I would say leverage your ecosystem. So we take, as we bring on interns or folks that may not know our environment, that's a great test of, does this make sense? Or do I need to have a lot of institutional knowledge in what I'm doing so that I can appropriately respond to escalate threats? So as you get into testing out these run books and validating this, leverage your internal resources so that way someone can pick this up. I'm not saying that, that just any Joe Schmo off the street, but, being able to then effectively have, some third or fourth string could actually get into there to respond appropriately back into like the derecho, that has like an internet connection that can kind of keep the lights on while people are trying to get connected.
So one comment on what you were saying with the party players, right? So people that are relevant, a part of those tabletops and those exercises, which a lot of teams don't realize that, including legal staff, legal counsel, executive leadership, for business continuity, right? So here we have an exercise or a demonstration of a test of control or response function, but what does that mean to the business, right? So what does that mean to continuity? What is the potential financial implications these issues could have? And that's a common thing that is missed, right? What does this mean? Does this mean that revenue is impacted for a couple of weeks? Are we involving a PR firm? Do we have a PR firm active? Are they part of the conversation? Are they part of the IR plan? Have they been documented to be part of this conversation, right?
We'll go ahead and continue on to incident response, which happens to be our next topic here. So what are the critical elements of an effective incident response plan, and how can organizations ensure swift and coordinated responses to cyber incidents?
Yeah.
Did I just read the wrong thing again? All right. Win for me. All right, let's go to cloud security then. With increasing resilience on cloud services, what are the key challenges and best practices for ensuring robust cloud security?
So I kind of touched on this a little bit beforehand, but I really think it gets into the cloud being a force multiplier, so either for good or for bad. So if you had great vulnerability management practices when you go to the cloud, you can enhance that through some of your automation and some of the native controls that you may be able to put, like AWS config management. But if your vulnerability management maybe was lacking before you went to the cloud, I'd say beware, because it's not going to get better. So it's going into that eyes wide open and then inspect what you expect. So one of the things as we started migrating, we want to make sure that, again, back into shared responsibility, where does the buck stop and then who's accountable? Because there's certain things that, when you're on premise, you had visibility into. We had full packet inspection, inter switch all the way to the edge. We get to the cloud, Amazon frowns on that a little bit. So, getting into what we can inspect and then compensating controls to get that telemetry And then, one of the things we can then leverage is, I'll say, the scalability. So one of the items that we got into is, tying natively into, say, CloudTrail with Lambda to auto-orchestrate like a band hammer across our ecosystem, and then being able to auto-roll that back out, but then rolling that including of your change management. So it gets into leveraging the strengths where they lie, but going into it with your eyes open and not just expecting either it to be the end of the world for you going to the cloud, or it's going to be the utopia going to the cloud. So just being aware.
One of the things that we ran into while going to the cloud was our break glass accounts. So those have to be probably pre-configured. A lot of those were already set to SSO mandate. Well, if that becomes a problem that I can't have SSO, I can't get to configure my break glass accounts because I can't get in there to do it. So we kind of skipped a couple steps in those incident response plans. So having to go back and rework those things to make sure that we could have access to those accounts when we actually needed them.
Being a financial institution, we're required to manage everything on a risk-based approach. Our cloud services really starts from day one when the department wants to bring it in. We have multiple committees that it has to go through, get approved based on its risk. Then it hits our vendor program and all the due diligence. The SOCs get reviewed, all the controls. Then when it hits our system, because it's touching our network, we need to know from what the CIEV is, confidentiality, integrity, availability, and volume risk is. And from there, we have to take it one step further to risk assess the service that they provide and the risk that they bring to the organization, know what threats could impact that service that they're providing or the hosted service provider itself, and then assess all the controls for effectiveness. We do that a number of ways, either meeting with the vendor, looking at SOC reports, and we have to detail all the controls. And then from there, it's a continual monitoring of that. Based on the risk level that service or vendor brings to the organization, it has to roll up to risk committee. If it's above a certain level, the board has to approve it. If it's a high risk or it's above our tolerance level. So throughout the life cycle of the cloud service that's being provided, that is constantly monitored and updated. So if an audit report should reflect that there's a gap in one of their controls, we have to mark it in our system, note the risk, additional risk that control may bring to the organization, and then that's how we track it and keep the board informed of the risk that hits our organization.
Yeah, that's really good comments. Yeah. With cloud security, I mean, we talked a little bit about AWS, so I'll talk about Azure. One of the big things that we see with active compromises, right? Is everybody familiar with evil jinx accounts? Evil jinx attacks? Anybody? Okay. So it is a man-in-the-middle style of attack that is able to harvest credentials and bypass MFA. Right? It is very, very, very common right now. With that, some of the mechanisms that can combat that type of attack is implementing proper controls in a layered approach. Right? So any cloud security, a good adoption is to have layered approaches. So in Azure, we're talking about conditional access. So this means not just MFA, not just, hey, we blocked the evil IPs from failed login attempts, right? That's cool, right? That's one way to start responding to active failed attempts and active things that are going on. But as far as controlling these, the things that we're seeing that make a difference is limiting access to specific resources, right? So this means, hey, this is a managed device. It's joined to our Azure AD. It's trusted. It's a good device. We're going to let them contact Exchange, right? We're going to allow this device or this resource, this user, to be able to access the mail system. We're going to let this user access, SharePoint. So having controls in place there for the user side of the house is one area that lateral movement is possible. So if a user is over-provisioned for Power BI, right, or flat out they get their account compromised, these areas can also traverse onto on-prem. And I've got a story to share with some on-prem stuff, and we'll talk about that. But just cloud security in general, it is an area where things can laterally move and present themselves as not just cloud security. It's your whole organization. Cloud security isn't just up there. It's relevant to the entire organization. So I guess my perspective is to stop looking at it as somebody else's data center and looking at it as an extension of your own control at home, right?
Anybody have any questions on anything for the first little bit here? All right, we'll go ahead and keep going. For IoT security, as the Internet of Things expands, what security considerations are paramount, and how can vulnerabilities in IoT devices be addressed?
So with IoT, is anybody familiar with OUIs? Like MAC addresses? Okay, cool, awesome. Yes, absolutely can be spoofed. But a huge assistance and gain is leveraging some of those OUIs, right? And determining baselines for a specific type of devices, right? So you can create ACLs on your network with segmentation, right? And so how do we prevent, something being introduced to the environment that's IoT that can potentially have some type of rootkit, some type of malicious thing that could infect or laterally move to the rest of infrastructure? Network segmentation and behavioral monitoring. So if we know that this device, right, is, let's say, an LG fridge. They now have smart fridges, if you can believe it. If you can baseline and understand what is normal, you can find evil, right? So baseline, understand what is communicating with that LG device, and profile it. So create firewall rules, create ACLs, only allow it to connect to what it needs to. Don't allow routing tables. Don't allow it to talk to network equipment that it shouldn't be touching, right? So creating areas where there's prevention, you're not going to have as much of a risk. It still presents a risk, right? So there's IoT everywhere. I used to work in a lot of medical infrastructure, and that stuff's rampant, right? So everything plugs into everything. And so identifying where you can isolate this infrastructure and still have it a part of the organization, because it is a very relevant presence and very relevant place to have it, right? There's a need, right? The business has identified a need. Your goal and your focus as security experts in your field is to identify what it should and shouldn't be able to do.
From my perspective, the risk technique that I use is avoid it. At all costs, avoid it. However, that sometimes it's not always the case. We had an acquisition. Through the acquisition, they used Internet of Things. We were able to eliminate most of it, but the HVAC system had an IoT device that had multiple branches that needed to run. To Ben's point, segregate it, don't put it on your network, don't take that risk.
I was just going to second your avoided comment. So, for us, one of the things, like I mentioned in my talk, we extend a lot of our security awareness out to our end user compute of, hey, it's your home. You got questions. How can we help? I know one of the common things we got, especially with the pandemic, was, I've got a Google Nest, or I've got an Alexa, I've got, whatever. How can I help make myself more secure? Because I'll be the first one to say I like some of that convenience. So just a simple thing of, you've got a guest network already embedded in your home. Just connect it all to there. So get that segmentation in something that doesn't have to be overly technically complex. Does it reduce all your risk? No. It helps, address some of the main concerns you may have, while also, minus the privacy stuff, minimizing some of that foothold, besides the fact that it's always listening and now recommends me to order a case of apple cider constantly. So, again, it's constantly being aware, and then also, like we tell our folks, as you're working from home in your home office, don't have Alexa sitting in there. You have that as you're dealing with confidential conversations of not having there, but giving users guidance, to help them out in that type of ecosystem, even if we don't have them like formally within our corporate ecosystem.
So I wanted to add on the personal computing side, so the home user side. If you all don't have, a separation of network at home, there's also an option for device isolation. So to not allow specific pieces of infrastructure to talk to other things. And we're talking at home, right? So our Nest, right, if we have a thermostat, you can network isolate that to not be able to talk to the TV, right? So you can actually do that. So it can talk to the internet for the back end, but not allow lateral movement on your network, right? You can actually do that, and that's just usually a checkbox on most modern routers. Highly recommend that.
Adding to this and kind of going to the second step, so once we avoid everything that we can and do all of those things, what's the follow-on to that? Are we sure that our TI organizations and their vulnerability scans are actually going to look at these things after we have, allowed them to be on our networks? That security camera that hooks up to your badge system that's been on there for the last 15 years that has an IP address somewhere, is anybody even checking that thing? Does it need an update? Does it have an update? Does it have vulnerabilities? Those don't usually pop in all of our random scans. So that was just my 2 cents to add in to make sure that we're doing those as well.
Yeah, comment on that. So as far as like when I was saying baselining on how that infrastructure is working, so if you can identify what normal traffic is, and then all of a sudden you see something go blip, right? A different IP, something that's on your VPN is talking to the camera, that probably shouldn't be doing that. Go look at it. Have alarms. So you can create, so if you have a SIM or some other mechanism that's like SolarWinds, or some people have just simple network monitoring tools, you can essentially develop learning mechanisms to behavioralize what's going on. So know normal to find evil.
One thing I could add to that is to be sure you add it to your property book and your management. That way it adds to like end of life cycle, end of whatever. That way you can re-baseline it or renew or refresh your tech as you go down the road.
So attrition. So.
Yeah.
So the comment was having full life cycle on IoT. So not leaving pieces of infrastructure that are not managed to die on the land. So you just have this device that's out there. Maybe the team that supported it is no longer with the company, or they've moved on to a different piece of tech. So the call out was that I did that left-handed. That was pretty good. Good catch. So the call out is to make sure that when you're adopting these pieces of infrastructure into the organization is to have and develop a life cycle. Wonderful call out.
All right, next on our list is regulatory compliance. I know we've already covered that topic, that it's maybe not a favorite for all of us, but how can organizations effectively navigate and comply with evolving cybersecurity regulations and standards?
Okay, I'm going to cheat just a second and steal from my presentation of back to security. Compliance does not equal security. So my cheat statement is do security right, and then you can map to any compliance framework. That's not going to be an issue. Because as you get into the folks that are typically crafting this, they don't have a technical background. And so they may have very positive intent, but I'll pick on some of the regulations we ran into, some from like EFT fraud. We were mandated to accept certain types of things for folks to set up electronic file transfers that are a matter of public record. And even when we reached out to our to the regulators and said, this is garbage, we're seeing a lot of threat actors that are setting this up with public information, and you're mandating that we must accept this. This is ridiculous. And like, yep. That's super helpful. So back into it, building in then complementary controls of plan for the control failures of, okay, this may happen. Well, how are we going to catch this before we start fraudulently paying this hacker? So setting up those supplementary controls, and some of it may be procedural. It may not even be a technical control. So be aware of that, and don't necessarily trust in just the regulations that are going to save you. I'm not saying anyone in this room is going to feel that way. But again, do security right, and then just map your control objectives appropriately and have that great crosswalk ready.
I agree with Andy wholeheartedly regarding compliance. Compliance is not security. However, everything with compliance should map to all the controls, as he mentioned. And the difficult part of compliance is then meeting the objectives and goals of the strategy of the organization, making sure if they want a product, service that they want to initiate, how do you put all the controls that allow you to provide that service, yet protect the bank and meeting compliance initiatives. I'll go on record that I'm one that loves compliance, and the reason for that is it's hard to get management buy-in sometimes to spend those funds. However, using either threat intelligence and updating them on different types of scenarios, impacts that's hitting the financial sector, or last resort, well, based on compliance, I have to have this at this level, and in order to achieve that, I need X, Y, Z. So use it to your advantage when necessary. More on a last resort, because you don't want to threaten that it's something that you have to do, but make sure it's a good business decision, that you're what you want and how you apply it.
Yeah, I refer to both of you for compliance stuff, but I mean, one of the things that that is kind of a conversation on compliance is these things were developed by people to have a baseline, right? So you can have CIS benchmark, you can have these industry standard recommendations, and so compliance regulatory controls are typically bare minimums to identify and establish trust, right? So if you're working with another entity, right, and you have to be compliant, it is something that allows you to gain trust of another entity, right? So it's establishing accountability and responsibility of what you're managing. And so part of that is, unfortunately, it is something that's required, right, for a lot of industry standards by basics. The one thing that's commonly just kind of overlooked is that some of these controls are, in high school where they kind of make the statement that you get C's to, just pass, C's get the degree. That's kind of what it is, right? It is not the end-all, say-all, right? So you can meet regulatory compliance rules, but ultimately there are additional things that are not set and not regulated that you can still put in place and get that B, that A, right? So as far as making it applicable, yeah, hit the compliance rules, but it's not the last step. And a lot of people give up once they hit that compliance. Once they get that little sticker, that little certificate that says, hey, I got a SOC 2, cool. That doesn't mean give up and stop. There's still a lot to be done.
I think you have to be specific on those as well, because even a SOC 2 Type 2, there are 5 different services criteria. Have you gone through all of those? Another just point of, I've seen smaller companies just take them as launching points. We don't really have disaster recovery. We don't really know what that means. Well, okay, well, here's some NIST things to go look at. Here's ISO 22301. It's a great place to start, but as you pointed out, Ben, it is minimum viable product. It is not the full-fledged service.
Can I just add one more?
Please.
One difficult part of compliance is when you got conflicting or layers of response that's required. For instance, our regulator, the OCC, put a notification rule based on a breach when we need to notify them, then our customers, of a possible, a breach, a significant breach. They don't tell you exactly what a significant breach is. There's hints to what it is, but you have to define that. So we have so many days to send out that notification. Now you also have the state requirements. You have now, so we're a publicly traded company. The SEC last December initiated the final rule, which once a breach is confirmed, you have 72 hours to put that notification out there. So it's sometimes challenging, difficult to make sure that you're covering things like that. So at the worst possible time, and you're in the middle of that's why he said he's my hero, because I'll call him. It's hard to juggle sometimes and make sure you cover the checklist entirely because you got so many things in the middle of a breach. So once you confirm the breach, are you in the middle of it and then you got 72 hours to send these notifications out? You have to make sure you understand what the compliance is.
Quick comment there on the FCC stuff. So one of the things, has anybody seen this? Maybe don't raise your hand and let me know this. But one of the things that we've seen, and it has happened, where an attacker will target an organization, and these FCC regulations are actually hurting companies. They will attack, and they will make the notification. So the attacker will notify the FCC that there was a breach before the organization is ready to. And now they're coming after the organization when they weren't prepared enough to have that conversation yet. They have the 72 hours, but the attacker may do it in 2, may do it in 3. But having documentation and a playbook for how to handle that communication, PR and legal staff on board that is ready and able to respond to that type of conversation is key as well.
All right, we will take a turn to security awareness training. So what innovative approaches and technologies are being employed in security awareness training programs, and how effective are they in reducing human-related security risks?
So kind of like what I said initially, I wish we would have done it sooner. Reach out to marketing, whether internally, externally, find those partners, because we were getting some traction in security from a perspective of the results we wanted to see, but it's like, what can we do to take the next step? And I'm not saying sock puppets are for everyone, but it's definitely one of those things that find what will work in your organization to get that traction, so you can have those conversations, so you gain that trust, and so you can have they're going to reach out to you when maybe they did something that they shouldn't have done, so you can respond appropriately. But it really it takes that time, and sometimes it's it's scary, and so the more you can defang that through something like. I'll pick on, we have a video of my cat called Hacker Cat out there, and it's my actual cat. Yeah, and so make it entertaining. We have people going back and rewatching security videos. I mean, that never happened before we kind of shift things up. So don't hesitate to be bold out there because you never know. It's all about the results and how you're going to, don't be proud, take risks. Yeah. Was there a question in the audience or so? Someone raise their hand. No. Oh.
Just wanted to throw that out there.
Obviously, incident response is considered training, security training on our end. But one of the things that I don't think it's innovative, but everyone does phishing training. I think most companies, if not all, are doing phish training. Where I measure the success of the phish training isn't on us having a low matrix that's below tolerance level from an enterprise risk standpoint. It's what gets reported when we do those tests. We have a 60% reporting of our phish attempts, which it only takes one to report it for us to respond quickly. Our SOC is on it, and what I mean by on it is on a real threat email that comes in, we have 20% of the reported phishing where there are actual emails being reported. 20% are actual malicious email. From a security standpoint and response to mitigate that, that's outstanding because once we receive it, confirm it's a malicious email, then we can block it, check if anyone else in the organization received it, delete it, check in if we're concerned that it was opened up, if it was clicked, then we respond with a scan or whatever else. But trust but verify. I never opened it or I never clicked. But so I think from a maturity standpoint, having a mechanism in place where your employees can report suspicious emails is invaluable.
Just one quick thing on there, because I'm also very skeptical of the user I never clicked. Well, it turns out it may be the one-armed man, So as we got into how we're reporting off of here, like especially with our phishing training, and you get that user, no, it wasn't me, no, it wasn't me. Well, it turns out, well, it was Microsoft. So as the message was coming through, they sandboxed it, and so they actually clicked on the link for them. And so it looks like it came from the user, so it turns out, I guess they were not lying to us this time. So it's one of those things of be aware of your complementary control structures, especially as you're reporting these phishing metrics out to like leadership, and when you have like consequences, and just be aware of what may be jumping in front of that. Otherwise, again, someone may be getting the blame unnecessarily. So just PSA.
Yeah, I mean, as far as security awareness training, is harboring an environment and a culture change, right? So typically, does anybody do just the HR, phishing, and security training once a year? Does that ring a bell? Right. So,
Several times.
right, and maybe doing campaigns targeting towards certain people. So exactly to your point, establishing a documented way to escalate these issues. And the more important portion of that is to make sure that staff and employees know that if they end up clicking a link, if they end up going somewhere they shouldn't have, if they ended up installing a piece of software, we're human, right? And everybody makes mistakes. And obviously, depending on the organization, there is a acceptable use policy to understand what is okay and what's not. But harboring a culture that does not implicate the person and making sure that there's an escalation path to identify these things of malicious activity so that our users, our fellow colleagues and coworkers do not feel that we're targeting them or making them feel belittled, making them feel silly or stupid with phishing campaigns. Because honestly, one of the things that I've ran into is people will just stop opening emails, right? You're creating a lack of trust. And so redesigning that as the trustful thing is to have an escalation path and have it quickly, have it well documented, have it available. Preach that, right? And make it something that's easily digestible, easily understood. Phishing buttons are awesome. But ultimately, it is one of the largest vulnerabilities any organization is going to have is people. But making sure that they don't feel like they're stupid, like they're silly, like it was their fault, their mistake. Make sure that they don't feel that way. Harbor a culture that builds them up and makes sure that they're being taught on how to handle these things properly, and make sure that you're not shaming them.
I don't know that I can compete with sock puppets, but in one of my previous lives, we all know that our security training is sometimes not the most entertaining things in the world. So calling back to Benjamin from MySQL, wherever he went, Jurassic Park. So right around the time that we were doing insider threat training, we put out a campaign, a blog, or whatever you want to say it was, of why Jurassic Park was the perfect insider threat movie. So if you've ever seen it, Dennis Nedry is the computer guy who tries to steal the dinosaurs and sets off this whole catastrophe. But he didn't have separation of duties, he didn't have any monitoring, he didn't have all those different things that we care about in security training. We could attribute to the movie and make it down. And our analytics, our click-throughs of people actually paying attention to that was much higher than what they probably should have been paying attention to in our actual training. But it still gets the point across. And then they understand why they're doing the training, and it makes more sense and they pay more attention.
I think an important point, I was reminded by my incident response manager that getting in front of new employees, because they're targeted day one. So I know that's something that we're rather engaged with as she's conducting that training with our new employees as they're getting onboarded of, that's specifically covered in the phishing training, how to report. We give them a test campaign to make sure that the phishing button works for them. And again, start, like I said, building that culture of trust and talking through, mistakes happen. This is how we address them. This is how we fix things. And, like I said, starting to build that from the early onset and, getting that culture and really reinforcing that and then starting day one.
So So, quick comment on that. Love the Jurassic Park reference. That is literally my favorite reference for Dennis Nearly. It's literally insider threat. But as far as training, so commonly one of the attack mechanisms to bypass sandboxing and secure links, right? Do we have controls that are in place to sandbox these things? So one of the ways that an attacker can do this and bypass this is leveraging third-party applications or QR codes. So leveraging Adobe, OneDrive, a QR code, PDF that's shared through Box, Dropbox, they'll include the link. And then ultimately that link will then have a portal where it is like I was talking about earlier, EvilJinx, where they will then provide their credentials to access this document because the email was worded, hey, this is really sensitive, we need to get this going, it's a PO, something like that, and they'll provide their credentials and ultimately compromise the system, or their account for that matter. So making sure that these third-party mechanisms are included in that communication. So QR codes, stop scanning QR codes just to scan QR codes. We have a really good marketing campaign that's got a QR code that's like, did you just scan that? Like, did you really just scan that? And then it talks about not scanning stuff. So doing things like that in the office, if you have an on-prem presence, putting up a QR code, having people scan it, like put it in the bathroom, put it on the wall, like have fun with it, right? Doing those types of things gets people engaged and really teaches them because they go, oh, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. And then obviously make sure they're not feeling like shamed like I was talking about before, but things like that are interactive, that are fun, can't help. I actually have one of those. I walk around DEF CON and I have a big patch that's on my back and people scan it. It's wonderful, yeah.
All right, based on time, I think we'll probably go to our last question here. I'm going to choose supply chain security. So if any of you watched the news recently of pagers and things exploding overseas, that's kind of a third-party supply chain issue. So let's go with this one. In an interconnected business environment, what measures should organizations take to secure their supply chains against cyber threats?
So I'll start with a little bit of a non-traditional of like I mentioned in the keynote of as you're establishing relationships with these third parties, it's good to establish that ahead of when there's not a problem. So when you're able to then have those crucial conversations with them, and maybe again, if you have a really good partner, maybe they'll let you actually place some like canary tokens in their environment. So you can have, again, transparent conversations. So they're not going to let you put an intrusion detection sensor out there, but maybe you can have a relationship or a contractual obligation to where they're going to put something adjacent to your data. So it's being aware of where your critical vendors are, having those conversations, but then also making sure contractually you've got something in there, maybe aside from severability of, especially for key vendors, and knowing where there may be sub-dependencies, and then being able to follow that up to make sure, like, I know for us is like, oh, this is something we found critical, we're escalating. We're going to communicate that out to our key vendors and see how they're responding to that just as equally to there. So knowing what's important to your business and making sure you're protecting it appropriately, because it may not always be that technical vendor, but it may be an aspect of business risk. So just being aware and communicate.
Supply chain is one of the things that sort of keeps me up at night in addressing this because I could spend an hour going through the different risks with supply chain. The CrowdStrike event that occurred, I just recalled my wife waking me up at 3 a.m. and said, hey, are you aware of this global event going on? And so I said, no, let me see. Took me about 15 minutes. And I said, oh, we're fine. I went back to bed. The reason I was able to do that, I was able to log in, look at all our vendors, vendors, and see if any of those were listed as from our SOC review, as I mentioned. I know the controls. I know where they're storing data, who they use as partners. A lot of times now, if you look at the SOC review that they provide, they list their fourth, fifth party vendors in there. They should be required to do due diligence at the level that you expect. So it all starts from the contract, making sure if you have expectations from them, information that they should provide to you, put it in the contract, or otherwise they're not going to hold to it or not provide it to you. So it starts there. It starts with third-party vendor management, making sure you got a mature third-party program that's going to get all that information for you and then keep a database of it. So as I mentioned, I was able to go back to sleep, not lose a wink of sleep, because I knew what risk exposures we had. From a lessons learned standpoint, I want to touch on that because from an incident response, to me, obviously, respond, recover, and eradicate are the key areas for incident response. But for me, at the maturity level that we're at, the beginning end, preparation, and the closing end, the lessons learned, you can't mature your program if you're not learning something from it. So from this CrowdStrike, elements of the vendors that did have it, it wasn't the vendor going out, losing service, disrupting us. It was our own departments not having key elements on how to respond to. We only had 4 vendors that impact us. So we had a meeting right in the morning, everyone okay? And somewhere, oh no, the sky's falling. I said, wait a second here. Like the real estate. Knowing how the departments operate, what key areas of risk there are. I said, wait, aren't all your closing packets already closed out and out already? Well, yeah. I said, well, what do you have to get out today that you missed? Well, nothing. Okay, well, just do everything as far as your BCP plan. Oh, right, okay. So it was a non-event for us, a low-impact event for us, but that preparation and learning from it. So there were a couple things. Every incident, you should have some kind of takeaway to improve. And we take anything learned from and record it from lessons learned and put it in an audit tracker or a risk register and say, hey, we identified this as a problem, and it becomes an actionable item that we correct. So that, go back to the beginning, update your plan, whether it's the playbook or the BCP plan, whatever it is, you're constantly maturing. It's a living, breathing document that should always be updated. And the more you do that, the more mature the program comes, the better you're going to be, the plan is going to be effective, and the quicker the response and recovery.
Making sure that is a living document is exactly. So part of the incident response commander position is to make sure that they're making changes and living through that. It's key for that role. Yeah, exactly. As far as supply chain, right? So I kind of talked about it with IoT. Same concept, right? Understand normal to find evil, right? So if you know certain pieces of information from a vendor, things like that, just like IoT, you can find that evil. As far as what are the current risks and things like that? So talking about, like, for example, CrowdStrike. What was one thing that they did that a lot of people haven't realized yet? Well, there's a lot of outages in the world. The attackers now know what tool you use. Pretty scary, right? So a lot of people don't realize that when these things go down, and unfortunately that was a misconfiguration on their end, and they resolved it, and that's cool. But they also exposed what tools their customers utilize, which, if there was a 0 day, if there is a 0 day, they can now footprint that organization, unfortunately. And so the gap that creates, so when there are outages in the supply chain effect, areas that the attacker can now target, things you wouldn't think of, right? Things that a lot of people haven't picked up on that. And unfortunately, that is a very real thing. The other thing they've released is, hey, rebooting in safe mode disables CrowdStrike.
All right, we haven't officially been kicked off yet, but any questions from the crowd? All right. I think, one in the back.
Throw you a softball real quick. How's the panelists feel about Windows integration of features such as Copilot or Windows 11 recall?
Be aware. No. Again, communicate and make sure that you're having the proper mindset as you're going into there. Oops, we're time. We're done. No, I'm good.
I was just saying this is the last question.
Like all AI, we place blocks on them. The first thing I did was put like 26 blocks on it, different from GPT to any other AI. The problem is almost everyone's starting to use AI engines. So either we're going to have to restrict everything. It's helped limit or deter software that's not approved hitting our system. But more and more are popping up because people want to use these tools. And one of the things we did last year was update our acceptable use and put an AI policy, what's acceptable, and made sure everyone understood it must be approved. But they still pop up because I don't think a lot of people realize the AI engine behind it. So we're very guarded on allowing it. It's got to be a definite business purpose and not just someone's convenience. It helps them write emails or do their reviews or whatever they use it for. Marketing is probably the one that has shown and requested business purpose and gone through the process to approve it. So we're not saying that you can't have it. It's just we make sure that it's vetted correctly and all the risk is identified before and the user understands how they're to use it and not share data.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. The acceptable use policy, who doesn't have an acceptable use policy? That's a really common thing for AI right now. So it's actually one of the things that we have available on our site, which is cool. So if you don't have one, need help, we have a template to kind of help you with that. So with that, establishing what users should and shouldn't be doing for your organization with engagement in those tools. So recall, for example, that I'm hit or miss on. I mean, that is a very scary piece of infrastructure. It is the fact that if an attacker were to leverage that technology and pull back the screenshots and recordings of what, you could effectively see users, passwords, account information, PII, PHI, and without a control set to determine where that should or shouldn't be enabled is a scary thing. Yeah, absolutely. So as far as putting controls around that, one of the pieces is potentially DLP. So identifying where those pieces of information are being leveraged and accessed, along with establishing policy and procedure around those tools, right? As far as Copilot, the scary thing about just creating a group policy, right? If we go and block it and turn it off, they're going to create a VM to bypass the control set. So establishing ways to manage with allowing it with an acceptable use policy, allowing management, blocking third-party access tools, providing a corporate version may be a little bit easier to manage and monitor. It's not a terrible thing, right? So we all view what is now viewed as AI as an evil thing. I mean, a lot of people. It's a tool in the toolbox, right? So it's leveraged and should be leveraged as a mechanism to help you in your day-to-day life. And so if we all fear it, it's a scary road as well, because we have some people that really need it and desire the use of it, and we have others that don't want to touch it with a 12-foot pole. So there's a middle ground, right? So establishing a baseline of how it should be used and where it can be used, and monitoring that, and the use of where it can reference your critical infrastructure and your data. So the data that the organization, so intellectual property, right? Monitoring the use of the intellectual property of the organization, whether that PHI, PCI, whatever standard, making sure that there's a control set to monitor that behavior, right?
All right. I think that finishes for us. Thank you to the panel. Thank you everyone out there for listening to all of us. Have a good one.